Have you ever felt like you're just running on a treadmill? Just trying to keep everything from falling apart? In our businesses, our projects, even in our lives, there's this invisible force that's always pulling things toward chaos. Well, what if you could not only stop it, but actually reverse it? That's the whole idea behind something called Negentropic architecture, and we're going to break down exactly what that means.
I know, that's a pretty bold statement, but just think about it for a second. So much of what we do every day, fixing bugs, putting out fires between teams, restating the company mission for the 10th time, it's not really about building something new, is it? It's about patching up the old. It's this constant, exhausting fight against a natural downward spiral. We end up becoming managers of a slow, inevitable decline.
And that brings us to the big question. What if, instead of just pumping the brakes on decay, you could build a system that actively gets stronger, more organized, smarter over time? A system that literally defies the natural order of things. It sounds like something out of science fiction, but it's a very real concept in design and architecture.
Okay, so to understand how to reverse this decay, we first have to give our enemy a name. And it turns out it's a universal law that governs pretty much everything, from dying stars to struggling startups.
That enemy is entropy. You might remember it from science class. It's the second law of thermodynamics, but applied to everything we build. It's the reason a hot cup of coffee always gets cold. It's why your clean desk gets messy all by itself. And it's why a perfectly aligned team can drift apart without constant, deliberate effort. Entropy is the universe's default setting, and you have to know it's always on. So, if entropy is the villain of our story, then we're going to need a hero, right? We need an opposing force, an active strategy to push back against all that chaos. And that hero is called negentropy. It's the deliberate, conscious creation of order. A great way to think about it is a living tree. A tree is a perfect example of negentropy in action. It takes in all these disordered things, sunlight, water, carbon dioxide, and it transforms them into a highly complex, incredibly ordered structure. A negentropic organization tries to do the exact same thing, but with information, energy, and talent. So really, we're faced with this fundamental choice. On one side, you've got entropy. That's the easy path, right? The path of least resistance that always leads to decline. And on the other side, you have negentropy, the path of active creation. Now, it takes energy, it takes intention, but it's the only path that leads to real growth, order, and in the end, a lasting legacy. Now, here's where things get really interesting. You might think this is some cutting-edge idea from Silicon Valley, but it's not new at all. The roots of this go back over a century to this wild group of Russian thinkers who had an unbelievably ambitious goal. Let me introduce you to the Russian cosmists, led by a guy named Nikolai Fedorov. Way back in the 19th century, they came up with this idea they called the common task of humanity. And that task was to actively fight and reverse entropy. But they weren't just talking about keeping your company organized. They were talking about overcoming death itself and, get this, the resurrection of everyone who had ever lived. Yeah. Now, as extreme as that sounds, their core belief that we must actively build systems to reverse decay is the philosophical seed for a really powerful modern business blueprint. So how do we get from that massive cosmic idea of reversing decay and achieving immortality to something we can actually use in our organizations today? Well, this is where the philosophy gets turned into a blueprint. An engineer named Albert Tan took the cosmists' core idea and adapted it into what he calls the Negentropic Legacy Architecture, or NLA. It's a framework that's literally designed for institutional immortality. Okay, so how does this thing actually work? Tan breaks it all down into two core protocols. Two sets of rules that are designed to build a system that can, at least in theory, last forever. These are the two pillars of the whole architecture, the black box recorder and the ancestral upload. So let's take a look at what each one of these actually does. The black box recorder, well, it's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. Just like in an airplane, every single failure, every mistake, every crash has to be meticulously recorded. But here's the key. It doesn't stop there. The lesson from that failure is then encoded into a new procedure or a new system. And what's the result? The organization learns, it adapts, and it's basically immunized against that specific failure forever. It can't die the same way twice. Now, the second protocol, the ancestral upload, this one's even more radical. It's all about capturing the why behind the big decisions. The founders' core principles, their decision-making logic, it all gets digitized. Maybe it becomes a strict set of rules. Maybe it even becomes an AI model.
What you're doing is creating a digital mind of the company, making sure that original vision and strategic genius can guide the organization long after the founder is gone. So, when you combine these two protocols, learning from every mistake and preserving the core vision, you get something much more powerful than just a resilient company. You get a whole new way of thinking about how organizations can last.
And this is a really important distinction. We talk a lot about sustainability these days, which is really just about maintenance, keeping things the way they are. This is totally different. This is about evolution. It's about creating a system that is designed from the ground up to become more ordered and more intelligent with every single challenge it faces.
Albert Tan himself puts it perfectly. He says sustainability is for maintenance. I build negentropic architectures, systems designed to get smarter and more ordered as they age, defying the law of decay. It's not about just holding the line, it's about building something that actually gets better as it gets older, directly fighting back against that universal law of entropy we started with.
So I'll just leave you with this final thought. Imagine a system that encodes every lesson from every failure right into its DNA, and at the same time preserves its founding genius in a kind of digital mind. This isn't just a strategy for success anymore. It's an architecture for near perpetuity. It really makes you wonder, what are the actual limits to how long an organization or an idea or a legacy could truly last?